They laughed at her in the boardroom on the 42nd floor. In front of directors, legal counsel, and senior executives, Jonathan Aldridge called her a guest at a family table. Eleanor Aldridge smiled without warmth. Harold Aldridge reminded everyone that legacy could not be married into. Her husband Thomas said nothing. Monica Webb did not defend herself. She did not argue. She did not blink. What none of them understood, what had already been filed, signed, and wired 48 hours earlier, was that the controlling shares of their $5 billion empire no longer belonged to the Aldridge bloodline. They belonged to her. If you believe dignity speaks louder than arrogance, stay with this story to the very end. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I always find it powerful to see how far stories of justice travel. And if you value quiet strength and accountability, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Monica Webb had learned early that silence was not weakness. It was leverage. She grew up in a two-bedroom house outside Chicago, the daughter of a public high school math teacher and a nurse who worked night shifts at a county hospital. Money was never abundant, but numbers were. Spreadsheets covered the family computer long before social media ever did. At 16, Monica could balance a household budget faster than most adults could fill out a tax form. By 24, she held an MBA in finance and had secured a position as a risk analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. She was not the loudest voice in a room. She did not network aggressively. She did not chase attention. What she did was read. She read quarterly earnings reports the way others read novels. She read footnotes. She read the language that lawyers tried to soften and the assumptions buried in projections. She learned that companies rarely collapsed because of dramatic villainy. They collapsed because someone believed the numbers would eventually fix themselves. Monica never believed that. She met Thomas Aldridge at a charity fundraiser in Boston. He was standing slightly apart from the center of the room, polite but detached, as if the event were happening around him rather than because of him. Most people approached him because of his last name. Monica approached him because he looked uncomfortable. Thomas was the second son of Harold Aldridge, chairman of Aldridge Global Communications AGC, to the financial press. The company owned television networks, regional newspapers, digital platforms, and a production arm that had once dominated primetime ratings. It was valued at roughly $5 billion at its peak. The Aldridge name carried weight in boardrooms and in political circles. But Thomas had never been positioned as the heir. That role belonged to his older brother, Jonathan. Thomas spoke about architecture and nonprofit housing initiatives more easily than he spoke about earnings per share. Monica noticed that. She also noticed the way he hesitated whenever someone mentioned the family business. There was affection between them that grew gradually, almost cautiously. Their relationship was built not on spectacle, but on long conversations about responsibility, ambition, and what it meant to inherit something you had not built. When they married 3 years later, the wedding was tasteful, controlled, and carefully photographed. Eleanor Aldridge ensured that every image projected unity. Monica wore a simple gown. She thanked every guest personally. She entered the Aldridge family not with naivety, but with clarity. From the beginning, she understood the hierarchy. At family dinners in Manhattan, she was seated between Thomas and whichever aunt or cousin required polite conversation. Discussions of corporate strategy happened at the far end of the table near Harold and Jonathan. When Monica once asked a question about a recent acquisition, an over-leveraged streaming platform that analysts had quietly criticized, Jonathan smiled thinly and replied, "It's more complex than it looks from the outside." She had nodded. It was not the first time someone underestimated her. It would not be the last. Monica did not confront slights in public. She cataloged them. She observed the patterns. She noted who spoke over whom, who deferred to whom, and who controlled the flow of information. In rooms where most people saw confidence, she saw fragility disguised as certainty. Over time, she began reading AGC's public filings. Not because she planned anything, not because she suspected wrongdoing, but because numbers told stories that people did not. AGC's revenue from traditional advertising had declined steadily for 6 consecutive quarters. Digital growth was slower than projected. Debt obligations tied to recent acquisitions were structured aggressively with significant maturities approaching within 3 years. The company's press releases, however, remained optimistic, full of phrases like strategic repositioning and long-term value creation. Monica recognized the tone. She had written similar language in her early career when firms needed to calm investors without revealing internal concern. She never mentioned her observations at family gatherings again. Thomas sometimes noticed her reading late-at-night financial statements open on her tablet. "You don't have to study them," he would say gently. "It's not your responsibility." Monica would look up, her expression neutral but thoughtful. "Numbers are everyone's responsibility," she replied once. He did not fully understand what she meant. Thomas loved her. Of that there was no question. But love did not make him immune to the gravitational pull of his family's expectations. He relied on AGC dividends for much of his lifestyle. The apartment overlooking Central Park, the invitations to political fundraisers, the assumption that doors would open because his surname preceded him. Monica had never relied on those doors. She maintained her own consulting work, quietly advising small private equity groups on risk exposure. She never used the Aldridge name in professional settings. Her maiden name, Webb, remained on all her filings and contracts. Independence to her was not symbolic. It was structural. At one board-adjacent dinner, a senior executive asked Monica what she did with her time. She answered calmly, "I evaluate risk." The executive chuckled. "Must be relaxing not having shareholders to answer to." Monica smiled faintly. "Every decision has shareholders," she said. "Some just don't realize it yet." The comment passed without consequence. But the narrator, who sees further than the room that evening, understands that Monica had already begun constructing a mental ledger not of grievances, but of vulnerabilities. She noticed that AGC's stock price dipped sharply whenever rumors of internal restructuring surfaced. She noticed that institutional investors were slowly reducing their positions. She noticed, too, that a particular hedge fund known for activist interventions had begun shorting media conglomerates with similar debt profiles. Monica did not act impulsively. She gathered context. What she never told Thomas, what she never told anyone, was that she had begun modeling AGC's financial structure independently. She recreated its balance sheet using public data. She stress-tested scenarios, advertising downturns, refinancing failures, regulatory scrutiny. In several projections, the company required external capital within 18 months to maintain stability. She felt no satisfaction in the analysis, only clarity. At the next annual board meeting, the one that would later be remembered not for its humiliation, but for its silence, Monica entered the glass-walled conference room without expectation. She wore a tailored navy suit. She carried a slim leather notebook. She did not intend to speak unless necessary. Jonathan Aldridge glanced at her briefly before addressing the directors. Eleanor's gaze lingered just long enough to assess, to measure, to dismiss. Harold maintained his composed authority at the head of the table. Monica sat at the far end beside Thomas. She did not know yet how the next chapters would unfold in detail. But she sensed something unsustainable in the air, a tension between projection and reality. The narrator knows more than she does in that moment. The narrator knows that within months, Monica Webb will hold more legal authority over Aldridge Global Communications than anyone at that table. The narrator knows that the laughter she endured will echo differently once bank records, emails, and recorded conversations surface. But for now, Monica simply observes. She watches how Jonathan avoids direct discussion of refinancing risks. She notes how Harold redirects questions about debt maturity schedules. She sees how Eleanor controls the narrative whenever image is threatened. And she writes. Not because she is planning revenge, not because she seeks power, but because truth, when ignored long enough, creates its own reckoning. Monica understands that better than anyone in that room. She has always understood that, and she is patient. Aldridge Global Communications had been built on certainty. That was how Harold Aldridge preferred to describe it. Not ambition, not risk, certainty. The company began 4 decades earlier as a regional newspaper chain in Ohio, founded by Harold's father, William Aldridge, a man who believed information was power so long as it was carefully managed. William had acquired struggling local papers, consolidated operations, and expanded into radio during the deregulation era. By the time Harold inherited leadership, the foundation was strong, disciplined, and politically connected. Harold transformed it. He expanded into cable news in the late 1990s, then digital platforms, then streaming content. AGC became a recognizable media presence in American households. Its anchors moderated presidential debates. Its entertainment arm produced award-winning dramas. Politicians courted its favor. Investors trusted its growth trajectory. And the Aldridge name became synonymous with control. Control of narrative, control of capital, control of succession. Succession, in Harold's mind, had always been simple. Jonathan, the eldest, possessed the composure and assertiveness expected of a future CEO. He attended Harvard Business School. He joined AGC straight out of graduate school. He learned operations acquisitions and investor relations. He spoke in polished sentences about strategic leverage and long-term value. Thomas, by contrast, drifted toward philanthropy and urban planning. He joined committees, not boards. He advocated for housing reform instead of market consolidation. Harold tolerated this, but he never mistook it for leadership. And then there was Monica, an addition, an external variable. Harold had not objected to the marriage openly. That would have appeared regressive. But privately, he viewed Monica as a temporary orbit around Thomas, pleasant educated, but peripheral to the machinery of AGC. Eleanor shared this view, though she expressed it with more refinement. To her, Monica was an aesthetic adjustment to family photographs, not a strategic presence. Jonathan was less subtle. From the beginning, he regarded Monica with a polite impatience reserved for people who ask questions without authority. Monica noticed all of this. She also noticed the numbers. By the time she had been married into the family for 3 years, AGC's external image remained glossy, but its internal metrics were shifting. Revenue from legacy cable channels had declined by 12% over 2 fiscal years. Digital subscription growth plateaued after aggressive introductory pricing campaigns. Several acquisitions, particularly a West Coast streaming startup, had been financed through layered debt instruments that carried variable interest rates. Monica read the annual Form 10K filings carefully. She paid attention to the sections most casual readers ignored: risk factors, contingent liabilities, refinancing assumptions. The language grew increasingly defensive. Phrases such as subject to market conditions and anticipated restructuring efficiencies appeared more frequently. Monica understood translation. These were signs of strain. She began mapping AGC's debt maturity schedule on her own spreadsheet. Large tranches were due within 36 months. Refinancing would require favorable credit conditions and investor confidence. Confidence, she knew, was fragile. At a private dinner in the Aldridge penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Jonathan described an upcoming acquisition as bold and necessary. He framed it as a signal to the market that AGC remained aggressive. Monica asked a single question: "How are you hedging the interest rate exposure?" The table quieted. Jonathan's smile sharpened. "We have advisors for that." Monica inclined her head. "Of course." Eleanor changed the subject to an upcoming charity gala. Thomas squeezed Monica's hand under the table later that night. "You don't have to challenge him," he murmured gently as they rode the elevator down to the private garage. "I wasn't challenging him," Monica replied. "I was asking about exposure." Thomas sighed. "It's complicated." She did not argue, but in her quiet study at home, she recalculated scenarios. If interest rates rose even modestly, AGC's refinancing costs would spike. If advertising revenue continued its decline, cash flow would tighten. If either occurred simultaneously, the company would face uncomfortable decisions, asset sales dilution, or emergency capital injections. Monica did not assume wrongdoing. She assumed overconfidence. And overconfidence, she had learned in her career, often preceded rationalization. Meanwhile, within AGC's executive floors, pressure mounted. Jonathan had authorized an aggressive stock buyback program months earlier intended to stabilize the share price and signal strength. The move pleased short-term investors, but reduced liquidity. CFO Brian Keller reassured the board that projections remained within acceptable parameters. Harold trusted Brian. He valued loyalty. Eleanor focused on messaging. She coordinated interviews, curated narratives, and ensured that headlines emphasized innovation rather than contraction. The outside world saw continuity. Inside, small fractures widened. Monica noticed unusual volatility in AGC stock over a 2-week period. Institutional investors reduced their holdings quietly. A hedge fund known for opportunistic acquisitions began accumulating shares at depressed prices before offloading them again. Something was shifting beneath the surface. Monica began modeling not just stress scenarios, but opportunity windows. If AGC's share price continued to decline due to temporary market fear rather than structural insolvency, an external entity could acquire significant equity at a discount. A controlling stake would require coordination, discretion, and capital, but it was not impossible. She did not yet intend to act, but she understood the mechanics. At another board-adjacent gathering, she overheard a conversation between 2 mid-level executives discussing bridge financing. The phrase lingered. Bridge financing was typically short-term, used to maintain liquidity between larger transactions. It suggested cash flow strain. Monica did not confront them. She filed the term away. The narrator, who sees across timelines, understands that this was the moment Monica's analysis shifted from passive observation to strategic awareness. Not because she desired control, but because she recognized vulnerability. And vulnerability in a public company rarely remains hidden. One evening, as rain streaked the windows of their Manhattan apartment, Thomas found Monica reviewing AGC's latest earnings call transcript. "You look like you're preparing for an exam," he said lightly. In a way, she answered. "What kind of exam?" "One that tests whether reality matches presentation." Thomas hesitated. "You think something's wrong." Monica closed the laptop gently. "I think something's fragile." He sat beside her. Jonathan knows what he's doing. She studied him carefully, not critically, just honestly. "Do you believe that?" she asked, "or do you need to?" Thomas did not answer immediately. The silence between them was not hostile. It was heavy. Monica did not press further. She knew that loyalty inside a family dynasty was not easily disentangled from identity. Harold had built more than a corporation. He had built a legacy narrative. To question the company was to question the patriarch. But Monica did not see AGC as a monument. She saw it as a balance sheet. And balance sheets obey mathematics, not hierarchy. As quarterly reports continued to show incremental erosion masked by optimistic projections, Monica began drafting a separate financial model, one that explored what would happen if AGC's stock fell below a certain threshold. In that model, she created a hypothetical holding company. She named it something neutral, unremarkable, temporary. At the time, it was an exercise, a way to understand leverage structures, a thought experiment in corporate control. She did not yet know that this thought experiment would become real. She did not yet know that within months, the Aldridge empire would confront not just market pressure, but internal exposure. For now, she remained the quiet wife at the edge of the table, listening, calculating, waiting. The annual board meeting was staged like a performance. The conference room on the 42nd floor of AGC's Manhattan headquarters was all glass and brushed steel, designed to signal transparency and permanence. Outside, the skyline stretched in controlled symmetry. Inside, the long walnut table reflected the overhead lights with deliberate precision. Monica Webb entered beside Thomas, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She wore a tailored navy suit, minimal jewelry, and carried a slim leather notebook. No one stopped her at the door. She was, after all, family. But she was not bored. That distinction mattered. Harold Aldridge sat at the head of the table, composed and authoritative. His silver hair was combed back as cufflinks, understated but expensive. To his right sat Jonathan Aldridge, CEO, confident in the way men are when they have rarely been contradicted in public. CFO Brian Keller adjusted a stack of documents near the projector. Eleanor Aldridge occupied a seat slightly apart, not officially on the board, but influential enough that her presence shaped the room. Other directors, independent in name, interwoven in loyalty, took their seats. Monica and Thomas sat near the end. The meeting began with rehearsed efficiency. Jonathan presented a slide deck outlining strategic repositioning initiatives. Revenue challenges were framed as market evolution. Debt restructuring discussions were labeled proactive capital optimization. The language was polished. Monica listened carefully. When Jonathan advanced to a slide detailing projected refinancing within the next fiscal cycle, she noted the assumptions embedded in the forecast. Interest rate stabilization, advertising recovery, successful integration of prior acquisitions, assumptions layered upon assumptions. A director asked about liquidity buffers. Brian Keller responded with confident reassurance. Harold nodded. The room relaxed. Monica raised her hand slightly, not high enough to interrupt, but enough to signal intent. Jonathan paused, faint irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but guarded. Monica spoke evenly. "Could you clarify the maturity schedule on the second-tier notes issued during the West Coast acquisition? Specifically the exposure if refinancing rates increase by more than 100 basis points." There was a fractional pause. It was subtle but real. Brian glanced at Jonathan. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "That's a technical detail our finance team monitors closely," he replied. "We have contingency strategies in place." Monica nodded. "I'm sure you do. I was asking about the timeline." A few directors shifted in their seats. One of them avoided eye contact. Eleanor's expression cooled almost imperceptibly. Jonathan smiled, a thin, measured expression. "This isn't a classroom," he said lightly. "We don't run hypothetical stress exams in open session." The comment drew a restrained ripple of laughter from one end of the table. Monica did not react. She simply wrote something down in her notebook. Harold cleared his throat. Family discussions remain within family. He added, his voice firm but controlled. "Operational details are handled by leadership." Monica lifted her gaze to meet his. "I understand," she said calmly. But the room had shifted. What had been subtle dismissals hardened into something more overt. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Leadership is inherited, not married into," she said. "There's a difference between observation and authority." The words were framed as a general principle. They were not delivered with raised volume. They did not require it. The implication was precise. Several board members looked down at their papers. Thomas felt the tension first as heat in his neck. He shifted in his chair but said nothing. His silence was not indifference. It was paralysis. He understood the hierarchy too well to challenge it in that room. Monica closed her notebook gently. She did not argue. She did not defend her credentials. She did not remind them that she held an MBA in finance, or that she had evaluated larger debt structures than AGCs during her consulting years. Instead, she folded her hands on the table. Jonathan resumed the presentation, now moving briskly through slides, as though accelerating would erase the exchange. But the humiliation had already occurred. Public, controlled, intentional. Monica knew the difference between oversight and exclusion. What had happened was not a misunderstanding. It was a message. You are present, but you are peripheral. The narrator, who understands the irony woven into the fabric of that moment, sees what no one else in the room can yet perceive. 48 hours earlier, a holding entity named Silver Harbor Holdings, LLC, had crossed the threshold of 51% voting control in AGC through a series of coordinated purchases executed over several weeks. The filings were prepared, the disclosures were compliant. The beneficial ownership documentation was legally airtight. The identity of the controlling shareholder had not yet been publicly disclosed. The board meeting continued for another 90 minutes. Jonathan discussed expansion strategies. Brian referenced cash flow management. Harold emphasized legacy. Eleanor steered conversation toward brand positioning and media narratives. Monica observed patterns. She noticed that Brian avoided specific answers regarding short-term liquidity. She noticed that Jonathan deflected when directors asked about credit rating reviews. She noticed that Harold relied heavily on assurances rather than documentation. And she noticed that Thomas stared at the polished surface of the table more than he looked at her. When the meeting adjourned, directors gathered their materials and exited in measured clusters. Eleanor stood gracefully smoothing her jacket and approached Monica. "You must understand," she said softly, ensuring only a few nearby could hear there are structures in place for a reason. "Not everyone needs to involve themselves." Monica met her gaze. "I agree," she replied. Eleanor interpreted that as compliance. It was not. In the hallway outside the conference room, Thomas finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "They shouldn't have." Monica shook her head once. "It's fine." But it was not fine. It was instructive. As they walked toward the elevator, Jonathan passed them, speaking into his phone about an upcoming investor call. He did not look at Monica. Harold remained behind, with Brian's voices low and urgent. Monica noticed the urgency. In the elevator's mirrored walls, Thomas studied her reflection. "You didn't deserve that," he said. Monica looked at him. "This isn't about deserving," she replied gently. "It's about structure." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," she set her tone, "even that authority without accountability eventually exposes itself." Thomas did not fully grasp the weight of her words. He would. That evening, Monica returned to her study and opened her laptop. She reviewed the finalized documentation from Silver Harbor Holdings. She confirmed that transfer confirmations had cleared. She checked the timestamp on the final acquisition tranche. Everything was in order. She did not feel triumph. She felt responsibility. She had not purchased AGC because of humiliation. The process had begun long before the boardroom incident. But the incident clarified something essential. They believed ownership was hereditary. She understood it was contractual. In the quiet of the apartment, she drafted an email to Rachel Morgan, her corporate attorney. "Prepare formal notice," she wrote. "We will request a special board session." She paused, then added timing within 1 week. She closed the laptop. Outside, the city moved without awareness of the shift that had already occurred inside its skyline. In the Aldridge household, dinner would proceed as usual. Eleanor would discuss appearances. Harold would speak about legacy. Jonathan would review projections. None of them yet knew that the structure they defended so confidently had already changed. Monica did not need to raise her voice. The documents would speak. And when they did, the room would not laugh. Silver Harbor Holdings, LLC did not begin as an act of rebellion. It began as a spreadsheet. Months before the boardroom humiliation, Monica had opened a blank financial model late one evening, more out of intellectual discipline than intent. AGC's stock had dipped below what she considered its intrinsic asset value. The market was pricing fear. She was evaluating fundamentals. At first, it was an academic exercise. If a third-party investor believed AGC's core media assets were undervalued, if restructuring were possible, what would an acquisition pathway look like? The model became detailed quickly. Monica mapped outstanding shares, institutional ownership percentages, insider holdings, and voting rights structures. She noted that while the Aldridge family retained a significant portion of shares, several institutional investors had grown impatient. Hedge funds had trimmed positions, Retirement funds were exposed but passive. A window existed. Quietly, methodically. She did not speak to Thomas about it. Not because she distrusted him, but because she understood loyalty binds faster than analysis. If he knew, he would feel forced to choose too early. Instead, she scheduled a meeting under her maiden name with Rachel Morgan, a corporate attorney in New York, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. Rachel was known for precision and discretion. She had represented activist investors before, never recklessly, always lawfully. They met in a modest conference room downtown. No Aldridge name was mentioned in the scheduling emails. Rachel reviewed Monica's preliminary model with professional interest. "You're describing a potential controlling stake acquisition," Rachel said carefully. "This isn't passive investing." "I know," Monica replied. "Is this personal?" Monica held her gaze. "It's structural." Rachel did not ask further. Over the next several weeks, Silver Harbor Holdings LLC was formed as a Delaware entity. Its ownership structure was layered but transparent within legal bounds. Monica remained the sole beneficial owner through a trust vehicle to ensure regulatory compliance. Every filing was prepared to withstand scrutiny. Silver Harbor began accumulating AGC shares gradually through market purchases, avoiding dramatic price spikes. Monica timed acquisitions around earnings calls and market dips. She analyzed trading volume patterns to prevent detection. The narrator knows that at this stage, Monica still did not intend confrontation. Her thesis was simple: AGC's underlying assets, regional networks, intellectual property libraries, production rights, were worth more than the market believed, provided leadership restructured responsibly. But as Silver Harbor's stake grew, Monica encountered something unexpected. She gained access to deeper financial disclosures available to significant shareholders. While still within legal frameworks, the transparency expanded, and the numbers troubled her. Bridge loans, intercompany transfers, unusual short-term liquidity injections routed through subsidiaries registered offshore. Monica traced the movement of funds across AGC's internal entities. Some transfers could be justified as operational. Others were less clear. She requested clarification through shareholder inquiry channels, phrased neutrally analytically. Responses were delayed. Rachel reviewed the patterns with her. "This isn't necessarily fraud," Rachel cautioned. "It could be aggressive cash management." "It's opacity," Monica replied. "Opacity erodes confidence." As Silver Harbor's position crossed 20%, then 35 regulatory thresholds required disclosures. AGC's Investor Relations Department issued a brief statement acknowledging increased institutional activity. Jonathan publicly described it as market rotation. Internally, concern began to surface. Brian Keller flagged unusual accumulation patterns in internal briefings. "An entity called Silver Harbor is consolidating," he told Harold and Jonathan in a closed meeting. "Who are they?" Jonathan asked. "Delaware-based. Ownership undisclosed beyond standard filings." Harold dismissed it initially. "Opportunistic investors. They'll exit when volatility settles." But Monica did not exit. She increased. The final tranche occurred 2 days before the annual board meeting, the meeting in which she would be publicly dismissed. The market had reacted negatively to a subtle earnings miss. AGC stock dipped sharply over 48 hours. Institutional holders offloaded shares to limit exposure. Silver Harbor absorbed them. When the transaction settled, Silver Harbor Holdings controlled 51% of voting rights. Control did not require noise. It required completion. Monica received the confirmation email at 9:17 p.m. She read it once. She closed her laptop. She did not celebrate. Ownership, she knew, was not victory. It was obligation. Only after the acquisition finalized did she allow herself to consider the personal implications. She now legally held controlling authority over the company her husband's family believed defined them. The irony was not lost on her. But neither was the gravity. The humiliation in the boardroom 2 days later did not cause her to accelerate. It simply clarified timing. After that meeting, when Eleanor implied leadership could not be married into Monica, felt no anger. She felt alignment. Authority was not inherited. It was documented. That night, she called Rachel. "It's time," she said. Rachel's response was calm. "We'll request a special board session under shareholder rights." "You're entitled." Monica understood the procedural steps: formal notice of significant beneficial ownership, request for extraordinary board meeting, disclosure documentation submitted in compliance with SEC regulations, presentation of restructuring proposal, but she did not yet disclose her identity publicly. Rachel recommended waiting until the session convened. "Shock has strategic value," Rachel noted carefully. Monica considered the phrase. She did not seek shock, but she understood its leverage. Meanwhile, in the Aldridge penthouse, tension simmered quietly. Brian Keller informed Jonathan that Silver Harbor's stake had crossed a critical threshold. Jonathan's confidence thinned. "Find out who they are," he demanded. "We're trying," Brian replied. "The filings are clean." Harold remained outwardly calm, but inwardly unsettled. Control had always been familial. Now it was numerical. Thomas sensed the shift before he understood it. He noticed his father's shorter temper, Jonathan's late-night calls, Eleanor's tightened composure. At dinner one evening, Jonathan mentioned activist interference. Monica listened without reaction. "What do they want?" Thomas asked. "Control." Jonathan snapped. "They think they understand media better than we do." Monica set down her fork carefully. "What if they understand balance sheets?" she asked quietly. Jonathan looked at her sharply. "This isn't your arena." The comment hung between them. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Monica was just, "It's fine," Monica interrupted gently. She did not argue. She no longer needed to. Back in her study later that night, Monica reviewed internal documents Silver Harbor had lawfully requested. The patterns of short-term loans through offshore subsidiaries were clearer now. The audio file from Lily Grant, the former executive assistant, had not yet surfaced, but the financial groundwork already suggested misrepresentation risk. If the SEC examined these structures under hostile conditions, exposure could escalate quickly. Monica did not intend destruction. She intended correction. Her proposal draft included immediate suspension of stock buybacks, transparent disclosure of liquidity risks, independent audit committee oversight, replacement of executive leadership pending review. She included no personal accusations, only data. Ownership without integrity was instability. The narrator sees what Monica herself only partially acknowledges: she has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Whether Thomas stands beside her or not will shape their marriage irrevocably. But for now, she remains steady. Silver Harbor Holdings exists. The documents are filed. The special board session request is delivered to AGC's corporate secretary the following morning at 8:03 a.m. By noon, Jonathan receives the notice. By evening, Harold understands the control has shifted. They still do not know who stands behind the entity, but they will. And when they do, the humiliation of a quiet question about debt maturity will feel very different. Monica closes her notebook. The structure has changed. Now accountability will follow. The first irregularity appeared small enough to dismiss. Monica noticed it on a Tuesday evening, while reviewing a tranche of internal financial disclosures that Silver Harbor Holdings was entitled to examine as majority shareholder. The documents had been uploaded to a secure portal late in the afternoon: balance sheets, cash flow statements, subsidiary transfers. She brewed tea before opening them. There was no urgency in her movements. Urgency distorted judgment. The line item was labeled Intercompany Bridge Adjustment. The amount was substantial: 8 figures moved from AGC's primary operating account into a Cayman-registered subsidiary named AGC Strategic Solutions Limited. Monica frowned slightly. Bridge financing between subsidiaries was not inherently improper. Large conglomerates moved capital internally for tax efficiency or liquidity management. But this transfer was timed 2 days before quarterly reporting deadline, and the subsidiary receiving the funds had reported minimal operational activity in prior filings. She cross-referenced earlier statements. The same subsidiary had received similar injections in the previous quarter each time, shortly before reporting periods. The pattern suggested temporary cosmetic adjustments to balance sheet liquidity. Window dressing. Monica did not assume fraud. She assumed intent to conceal weakness. She opened a fresh spreadsheet and began reconstructing the cash movement timeline. Each transfer, each reversal, each reclassification entry. At 11:42 p.m., she leaned back slightly. The transfers were reversed within days of quarterly disclosures, returning funds to primary accounts. The pattern created the appearance of healthier liquidity at reporting moments. She checked the signatory approvals. Brian Keller, CFO. Her face remained composed. The narrator understands that this is the moment Monica shifts from financial strategist to legal architect. Market miscalculations can be corrected. Manipulated disclosures trigger federal scrutiny. She forwarded the extracted data to Rachel Morgan with a single-line pattern review requested. Possible reporting risk. Rachel called the next morning. This could be interpreted as earnings management, Rachel said carefully. Not automatically criminal. But if disclosures misrepresent liquidity to investors, the SEC will not ignore it. Monica nodded, though Rachel could not see her. There's more, she replied. She had noticed unusual email references embedded in the document metadata. Phrases like temporary cushion and hold until after call. Silver Harbor's shareholder rights allowed limited access to certain internal correspondence related to financial governance. Monica formally requested a targeted review under fiduciary obligations. The request could not be denied without explanation. Within 48 hours, a batch of emails arrived. Monica printed them. She preferred paper when reading language that might later be evidence. One email from Brian Keller to Jonathan read, "We'll route through Cayman for optics. Just need it steady through earnings." Another from Jonathan to Brian. "After Q4, we'll clean it up. Market won't look that deep." Monica read the exchange twice. The words were not overt admissions of wrongdoing. They were worse, casual. She marked passages with a pencil, not highlighter. Highlighters felt emotional. Pencil felt procedural. That evening, Thomas entered her study quietly. He had grown accustomed to the sight of her surrounded by documents. "You've been working nonstop," he said. Monica did not hide the papers. "Liquidity transfers," she said calmly. Thomas approached the desk. "For AGC, yes." He hesitated. Jonathan mentioned activist pressure. "Is that what this is?" Monica met his eyes. There was no accusation in her expression. "This is about numbers matching statements," she said. Thomas exhaled, slowly. "You think they're lying?" "I think," Monica replied. "They're managing perception." He sat down opposite her. "That's what companies do." To a degree, she agreed. But there's a line between framing and misrepresentation. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "You're going to push this." "I'm going to review it," she corrected. He studied her quietly. The narrator sees the fracture widening, not because Monica is aggressive, but because Thomas is beginning to understand that her role is no longer peripheral. Monica did not raise her voice. She did not deliver ultimatums. She simply showed him the timeline of transfers. Thomas read the figures. His brow tightened. "They said liquidity was stable," he murmured. Monica said nothing. Silence again was leverage. The following day, Rachel scheduled a discreet consultation with a former SEC compliance officer. The review remained confidential, protected under attorney-client privilege. Monica insisted on procedural discipline. Every step must be lawful. The compliance officer's assessment was measured. If these transfers were disclosed clearly in footnotes, risk is minimal, he said. If they were omitted or framed misleadingly, that's exposure. Monica checked the footnotes. The language was vague. Short-term capital allocation adjustments, it read. No mention of temporary liquidity inflation. She added another document to her growing file. 2 days later, a new development emerged. An encrypted email arrived in Silver Harbor's investor relations inbox from an anonymous sender. Subject line: "You should hear this." Monica opened it carefully. Attached was a compressed audio file. She did not play it immediately. Instead, she forwarded it to Rachel first. "Screen for authenticity and legal admissibility," she wrote. Hours later, Rachel called. "It appears legitimate," she said. "Recorded in a conference room at AGC headquarters. Likely by someone present." "Content?" Monica asked. Harold discussing market optics. Jonathan referencing delaying certain disclosures. "It's not a confession, but it suggests awareness of fragility." Monica closed her eyes briefly. The pattern was consolidating. Bank transfers, email language, audio corroboration, none of it explosive individually. Together, it painted a structure of concealment. That evening, Monica walked past the Aldridge penthouse dining table where Harold and Eleanor were hosting two investors. She paused only long enough to exchange polite greetings. Eleanor's gaze lingered. "You've been quiet lately," she observed lightly. "I've been reading," Monica replied. Eleanor smiled. One must know what to ignore. Monica held her gaze. And what not to. The tension was imperceptible to guests. But it existed. Back in her study, Monica assembled her documentation chronologically. She labeled folders, intercompany transfers, email correspondence, earnings disclosures, audio transcript, pending verification. She was not building a weapon. She was building a record. The narrator knows that Monica's power does not come from ownership alone. It comes from preparation that anticipates legal thresholds. When she enters the special board session, she will not argue emotionally. She will present sequence. Sequence creates inevitability. Thomas knocked softly before entering later that night. "My father called an emergency executive meeting," he said. Monica looked up. "About Silver Harbor?" "Yes. They're trying to identify the owner." She nodded slightly. Thomas studied her face, searching for something: guilt, fear, hesitation. He found none. "Do you know who it is?" he asked quietly. Monica paused. "I do," she said. Thomas waited, but she did not elaborate. Not yet. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved steadily. Markets fluctuated without awareness of the internal correction approaching AGC's leadership. Monica reviewed one final bank statement before closing her laptop. The pattern was undeniable. Whether it rose to prosecutable fraud would depend on interpretation. But it certainly warranted investigation. And investigation required authority. Authority she now possessed. She did not smile. She did not feel vindicated. She felt responsible. Because once documentation leaves a private folder and enters a boardroom, consequences follow. Careers end. Reputations fracture. Families split. Monica understood that better than anyone in the Aldridge household. Which is why she moved carefully. Measured, patient. The numbers had begun speaking. Soon, she would let them speak aloud. The audio file arrived without a name, but not without intention. Monica listened to it for the first time alone. She closed the door to her study, turned off her phone, and placed her laptop in front of her, as though preparing for a formal hearing rather than a private review. Rachel had already verified the metadata. The recording had been made 3 weeks earlier in Conference Room B at AGC headquarters. Time-stamped, unedited. Monica pressed play. There was the faint scrape of chairs, the low hum of central air. A voice she recognized immediately: Harold Aldridge. "We just need stability through Q4, he said. "After that, we restructure." Jonathan responded. His tone was controlled, but sharper than usual. "We can't disclose the full exposure right now. It'll spook the market." Brian Keller's voice followed. "The bridge transfers keep liquidity ratios in range. It's temporary." A pause. Eleanor's voice softer but precise. "The narrative must remain strong. Investors panic when they smell weakness." The recording did not contain profanity. It did not contain explicit admissions of criminal intent. It contained something subtler and in many ways more dangerous. Conscious calculation. Monica stopped the playback midway and stared at the wall across from her desk. They knew. They knew the liquidity was fragile. They knew the public statements implied stability beyond what internal conversations acknowledged. They knew the transfers were cosmetic. Knowledge changed everything. The narrator understands that Monica's restraint in this moment is not emotional suppression. It is strategic calibration. Evidence must be contextualized, not reacted to. She replayed the recording this time, taking notes. Exact phrases, pauses, overlaps in speech. When the audio ended, she sat in silence for nearly a full minute. Then she called Rachel. "It confirms awareness," Monica said. Rachel's response was immediate but measured. "It strengthens the case for governance failure. We must proceed carefully. If you present this at the special board session, you need a structured argument, not accusation." "I'm not accusing," Monica replied. "You're implying breach of fiduciary duty," Rachel said quietly. "That's serious." Monica understood the gravity. Breach of fiduciary duty did not require theft. It required misrepresentation or negligence towards shareholders' interests. And she was now the majority shareholder. Later that evening, a second email arrived, this one not anonymous. It was from Lily Grant, former executive assistant to Jonathan Aldridge. Monica recognized the name faintly from event guest lists and corporate retreats. Lily had left AGC abruptly 2 months earlier. The official statement cited pursuing new opportunities. The email was brief. "I believe you're trying to understand what's happening inside AGC. I have documentation you should see. I didn't leave voluntarily." Monica did not respond immediately. Instead, she forwarded the message to Rachel. "Verify identity," she wrote. Within 24 hours, Rachel confirmed that Lily Grant had indeed worked directly under Jonathan for 4 years. She had signed standard confidentiality agreements, but was not bound from reporting misconduct. Monica agreed to meet. They chose a neutral location, a quiet cafe near Bryant Park. Midday, public but discreet. Lily arrived early. She looked tired, though composed. There was no dramatic flourish to her presence, no theatrical urgency. "Thank you for meeting me," Lily said. Monica inclined her head. "You reached out?" Lily nodded. "I didn't know who Silver Harbor was at first, but when I saw the filings, I guessed it wasn't random." Monica did not confirm. Lily opened a folder on the table between them. Printed emails, calendar invitations, notes from executive meetings. "They started moving money before earnings calls," Lily said quietly. "I scheduled those meetings. I typed up summaries. I heard the conversations." "Why come forward now?" Monica asked. Lily's jaw tightened slightly. "Because when I raised concerns internally, I was told I didn't understand how optics worked. A week later, my position was eliminated." Monica studied her carefully. Anger can distort truth. But Lily's voice carried something steadier, disillusionment. "Did you record the meeting?" Monica asked gently. Lily hesitated, then nodded. "I did." "Why?" "Because I felt like if I didn't, I'd question my own memory later." Monica understood that instinct. "Do you have more?" she asked. Lily slid a flash drive across the table. Internal memos, draft earnings language that was softened before release. Notes about delaying disclosure of certain debt triggers. Monica did not touch the drive immediately. "Have you shared this with anyone else?" she asked. "No." "Are you prepared for potential legal inquiry?" Lily inhaled slowly. "If it comes to that." Monica nodded once. "Rachel Morgan will contact you," she said. "You'll need representation." Lily blinked slightly. "You're not going to bury this?" Monica's expression did not change. "I don't bury facts," she replied. Back in her study, Monica reviewed the additional materials under Rachel's supervision. The memos revealed iterative edits to earnings statements, phrases like temporary liquidity enhancement replaced with strong cash positioning. Debt exposure notes shifted from explicit figures to generalized summaries. None of it screamed fraud, but together it suggested pattern. Pattern suggested intent. Thomas sensed the change in her before he understood its source. "You met with someone today," he said that evening. Yes. About AGC? Yes. He leaned against the doorway of her study. Monica. If this becomes public, it will, she said quietly. He fell silent. The narrator sees the fracture deepening not in hostility, but in inevitability. Are you trying to destroy them? Thomas asked. Monica looked at him directly. No. Then what are you trying to do? Correct the record. Thomas rubbed his forehead. They're my family. And it's my fiduciary duty, she replied. The words were not harsh. They were factual. Thomas exhaled slowly. You're the owner, aren't you? The question hung between them. Monica did not lie. Yes, she said. Thomas stared at her. For a moment, admiration and betrayal flickered together across his face. You bought it, he whispered. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because you weren't ready to know. His jaw tightened. Or because you thought I'd try to stop you? Monica considered that. Yes, she said again. Thomas laughed softly, not with humor, but disbelief. You outmaneuvered my entire family. I followed the numbers, she corrected. He paced once across the room. They humiliated you. This started before that. You could have walked away. I still can, she said. That stopped him. She closed her notebook gently. This isn't revenge, Thomas. It's governance. He looked at her as though seeing her fully for the first time, not as the quiet observer at family dinners, not as the polite wife at galas, but as a strategist who had been calculating long before anyone noticed. What happens now, he asked. There's a special board session next week, she said. Rachel will present the ownership disclosure. Then I will present documentation. Thomas swallowed. My father won't survive that. Monica's voice softened. If the documentation holds, your father made choices long before I did. The room felt smaller suddenly. Outside sirens echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that consequences always arrive from somewhere. Monica turned back to her desk. She organized the materials into presentation order, ownership, structure, disclosure, timeline of intercompany transfers, email excerpts demonstrating awareness, audio transcript, governance recommendations, no theatrics, no accusations. Sequence. Sequence creates clarity, and clarity, once established, cannot be easily dismissed. The Aldridge Empire had been built on narrative control. Monica would present documentation, and documentation does not raise its voice. It simply remains. Thomas did not sleep that night. Monica knew because she heard him pacing in the living room long after midnight, the soft rhythm of his steps crossing the hardwood floors of the apartment overlooking Central Park. He did not argue again. He did not plead. He simply tried to understand how the architecture of his life had shifted without his awareness. Monica remained at her desk until nearly 2 a.m, not because she wished to avoid him, but because the documentation required order. Emotion could wait. Procedure could not. The narrator understands that Thomas's fracture is not rooted in greed or cruelty. It is rooted in identity. For him, AGC was not merely a corporation. It was inheritance history and expectation. To learn that his wife now controlled it legally decisively was to confront a version of himself he had never examined. In the morning, he stood by the kitchen window, watching the early traffic below. You've already scheduled the session, he said without turning. Yes, Monica replied. Does my father know he knows Silver Harbor requested it? He doesn't know I am Silver Harbor. Thomas nodded slowly. He's trying to identify you, he said. They've hired forensic accountants. They won't find irregularities, Monica answered calmly. Everything was compliant. He turned then, studying her face. You planned for this. I prepared, she corrected. There was no arrogance in her tone, only precision. Thomas sat at the table. I need to ask you something, he said. Monica waited. If the board votes to remove Jonathan, if they push my father out, what happens to us? The question was not financial. It was existential. Monica walked to the table and sat across from him. That depends on you, she said gently. He swallowed. You're asking me to choose. No, she said. I'm asking you to decide what you believe. Thomas exhaled sharply. You're making this sound philosophical. It's not. It's my family. And it's my fiduciary duty. she repeated quietly. He closed his eyes briefly. Did you ever think of telling me earlier, he asked. Yes, and you would have felt obligated to warn them. He did not deny it. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, not warm, honest. Thomas had always lived between worlds, not the heir, not the outsider, not fully in control, not fully powerless. Monica's revelation forced him into a clarity he had avoided for years. You think they crossed a line, he said finally. Yes. You're certain I'm certain there is enough evidence to require review. He stood again, restless. And if they argue that this is normal executive discretion, they cannot, Monica said. That's why the documentation is structured chronologically. Thomas almost smiled at that. Even now she spoke like a strategist outlining a case study. You don't hate them, he said suddenly. No, Monica replied. You don't sound angry. I'm not. He looked at her carefully. Then what are you feeling? She considered the question. Responsibility. Thomas leaned back against the counter. You're going to dismantle my father's authority. I'm going to present facts, she said. And let the board dismantle him, if that's where the vote goes. Thomas ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture Monica had come to associate with internal conflict. You know what this will look like, he said. They'll say you targeted us. I purchased undervalued shares in a declining company, she replied evenly. That is not targeting, that is investing. And marrying into it, that was not strategic, she said quietly. That was personal. The truth of that lingered. The narrator sees the complexity here. Monica did not orchestrate her marriage as leverage. But once inside the Aldridge orbit, she refused to surrender intellectual autonomy. That difference matters. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited his father's office. Harold stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Manhattan stretching beneath him like a controlled empire. Do you know who Silver Harbor is? Harold asked without greeting. Thomas hesitated. I don't, he said carefully. Harold studied him. He had always read his sons well, but this time uncertainty clouded his assessment. This is an attack, Harold said. It's a shareholder, Thomas replied. Harold's jaw tightened. You think this is about governance? This is about control. Thomas remained silent. Jonathan built this expansion strategy, Harold continued. We've navigated worse markets than this. Thomas thought of Monica's spreadsheets, the liquidity transfers, the audio file he had not heard but knew existed. Have you? He asked quietly. Harold turned sharply. What does that mean? Thomas shook his head. Nothing. But something had shifted. Back at the apartment, Monica finalized her presentation structure with Rachel via secure video call. We'll start with ownership disclosure, Rachel said. Shock will destabilize their posture. I don't need shock, Monica replied. You need clarity, Rachel corrected. Shock is a byproduct. Monica nodded. Then documentation, Rachel continued. Bank trails first, emails second, audio transcript last. Why last? Because audio humanizes intent. It lands harder once the financial framework is established. Monica understood sequencing instinctively. And the recommendations, Rachel asked. Governance overhaul, Monica said. Independent audit committee. Temporary suspension of executive authority pending investigation. Transparent public disclosure. Rachel paused. You realize she said carefully that this will almost certainly remove Harold and Jonathan from operational control. Yes. And Monica's voice softened. That's his decision. That evening, Thomas returned home later than usual. He did not speak immediately. He poured himself a glass of water and stood near the balcony doors. They're preparing defensive statements, he said finally. Jonathan thinks this is an external hedge fund trying to pressure a buyout. Monica nodded. They won't see it coming, Thomas murmured. No, she said. He looked at her. I don't know where I stand, he admitted. Monica walked toward him slowly. You stand where your principles do, she said. That sounds simple. It isn't, she agreed. Thomas met her gaze. If I stand with you, I lose them. If you stand with them, you lose yourself, she replied gently. The words were not manipulation. They were observation. He closed his eyes briefly. I never wanted this, he whispered. Neither did I, Monica said. The narrator sees the truth in that. Monica did not wake up intending to control a $5 billion media empire. She followed numbers. The numbers led here. The special board session was scheduled for Monday at 10:00 a.m. 4 days away. 4 days for Harold to assume control was intact. 4 days for Jonathan to prepare a narrative defense. 4 days for Thomas to decide who he was when legacy and law diverged. Monica returned to her desk one final time that night. She printed the final version of the governance proposal. At the top of the document, beneath the Silver Harbor letterhead, she had written a single sentence. Transparency is not optional in public trust. She did not sign it yet. That would come later. For now, she waited. Quietly, Monday arrived without spectacle. There were no flashing headlines, no market rumors strong enough to hint at what was about to unfold. Outside AGC's Manhattan headquarters, commuters moved with the same indifference they carried every weekday morning. Coffee cups, phone calls, taxi horns. Inside the 42nd floor boardroom, however, tension gathered like static. The special board session had been formally requested by Silver Harbor Holdings under majority shareholder rights. The notice had been legal precise, impossible to dismiss. Harold Aldridge had no choice but to convene it. He entered the room early. Jonathan was already there reviewing prepared remarks. His posture was rigid, controlled. Brian Keller shuffled papers near the projector. Eleanor arrived shortly after, her expression composed but tight around the edges. Thomas walked in alone. Monica was not with him. That absence did not go unnoticed. Where is she? Eleanor asked lightly, though the question carried weight. At home, Thomas said. He did not elaborate. At 9:58 a.m., the corporate secretary confirmed that counsel for Silver Harbor Holdings had arrived. Rachel Morgan entered the room at exactly 10:00 a.m. She carried a slim leather briefcase. No entourage, no theatrics. The directors glanced at one another. Some recognized her name from prior M&A dealings. She took a seat midway down the table across from Jonathan. Thank you for convening this session, Rachel began, her tone measured. I represent Silver Harbor Holdings, LLC majority shareholder of Aldridge Global Communications. Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As disclosed in regulatory filings, Rachel continued, Silver Harbor currently holds 51% of voting shares. Jonathan leaned forward. We are aware of the holding entity, he said coolly. We are prepared to discuss your client's strategic intentions. Rachel nodded once. Before strategic discussion, there is a matter of ownership transparency. A slight shift rippled through the room. Rachel opened her briefcase and distributed a single-page document to each board member. Silver Harbor Holdings, LLC is solely owned by one beneficial individual. She paused, not for drama, but for procedural clarity. That individual is Monica Webb. The room did not erupt. It froze. Harold stared at the page, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something less disruptive. Jonathan's face drained of color before hardening into disbelief. That's absurd, he said sharply. Rachel did not react. The ownership structure has been reviewed and filed in compliance with SEC regulations, she replied. The documentation is attached. Thomas did not look at his father. He looked at the table. Eleanor's composure faltered for the first time. You're saying, she said slowly, that my daughter-in-law secretly acquired controlling interest in this company? Yes, Rachel answered calmly. Harold leaned back in his chair. For what purpose, he asked. Rachel folded her hands neatly. For governance review and fiduciary accountability. Jonathan let out a short, incredulous laugh. This is retaliation, he said. Personal retaliation disguised as shareholder activism. Rachel's expression remained unchanged. My client began accumulating shares months before the annual board meeting, she said evenly. The acquisition timeline is documented. Harold's eyes flickered toward Thomas. You knew, he asked. Thomas swallowed. Yes, The word landed heavily. Silence expanded across the table. The narrator understands that this is the moment authority fractures, not because control has shifted numerically, but because certainty has dissolved psychologically. Rachel continued. Silver Harbor Holdings is requesting immediate discussion of financial governance practices, specifically intercompany liquidity transfers and disclosure accuracy. Brian Keller shifted in his seat. What are you implying? He asked carefully. I am not implying, Rachel replied. I am presenting. She connected her laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared. A timeline. Quarterly reporting dates aligned with intercompany transfers routed through AGC Strategic Solutions. Limited. Cayman Islands. Amounts highlighted, reversals marked. The board members leaned forward. Jonathan crossed his arms. These are standard internal capital allocations, he said. Rachel clicked to the next slide. Side-by-side comparison of reported liquidity ratios and internal transfer timing. Temporary capital injections prior to earnings disclosures, she said. Reversed within days. Brian's face tightened. That is liquidity management. Without explicit disclosure, Rachel said. Harold's voice lowered. Are you accusing us of fraud? Rachel met his gaze. I am stating that the pattern warrants independent audit. The next slide appeared. Email excerpts. We'll route through Cayman for optics. After Q4, we'll clean it up. The room felt smaller. Jonathan leaned forward sharply. Context matters, he said. It does, Rachel agreed. She clicked again. Audio transcript excerpt. Harold's own words projected in black text. We just need stability through Q4. The air shifted. No one laughed. No one interrupted. For the first time, independent directors began exchanging glances, not of loyalty, but of calculation. Thomas felt the weight of the moment physically. He had not heard the recording, but seeing his father's words, transcribed in formal sequence, stripped them of defensibility. Harold's voice remained steady, but lower now. Strategic discretion is not criminal, he said. No, Rachel agreed, but material misrepresentation to shareholders can be. Jonathan stood abruptly. This is an ambush. Rachel closed her laptop gently. It is a disclosure. Harold looked at Thomas again. You stood by while she prepared this. Thomas's voice was quiet but clear. I stood by while the numbers were reviewed. Eleanor spoke for the first time since the slides began. You would dismantle your own family, she said softly. Thomas did not respond. Rachel resumed. Silver Harbor Holdings proposes the following actions. Immediate suspension of stock buybacks, appointment of an independent audit committee, temporary removal of CEO and chairman from operational control pending investigation, full disclosure to regulatory authorities. The words did not echo. They settled. Jonathan laughed again, though without humor. You think the board will vote against us? He said. One of the independent directors cleared his throat. We have fiduciary duties, he said quietly. Another added, if documentation supports this, we are obligated to act. Harold's authority, once unquestioned, now faced arithmetic, 51%, majority control. Rachel did not press further. My client will allow the board to deliberate, she said, but understand that failure to initiate review may result in direct regulatory referral. The implication was precise. Investigation could remain internal or become federal. Monica was not in the room. She did not need to be. Her presence existed in documentation, in ownership filings, in the irreversible mathematics of shares acquired. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan moved as it always did. Inside, legacy shifted. Harold straightened slightly. We will recess for executive discussion, he said. Rachel nodded and stepped back. Thomas remained seated. Jonathan's eyes burned with anger, not only at Monica, but at the realization that control had never been as permanent as he believed. The narrator sees what none of them yet fully comprehend. This is not the climax. The vote has not occurred. Authority has not officially collapsed. But the architecture has cracked. And once cracked structures rarely return to their original form. In a private office adjacent to the boardroom, the Aldridge family gathered briefly. Harold's voice was controlled, but edged. She humiliated us. Thomas shook his head. No, he said quietly. You humiliated her first. The words hung between father and son. No one raised their voice. They no longer needed to. Back in the boardroom, the independent directors reviewed printed materials again. Sequence, evidence, ownership. When they returned to the table, Harold's posture had changed, not defeated, but aware. We will proceed to vote on initiating independent review, he said. The gavel had not yet fallen. But control no longer belonged to bloodline. It belonged to documentation. And documentation does not bend to pride. The vote did not happen immediately. Power, when it senses its own fragility, often attempts delay. Harold requested procedural clarification. Jonathan questioned the admissibility of internal correspondence. Brian argued that context required full executive review before any formal action. Rachel Morgan did not object to deliberation. She expected it. But she did not withdraw the documentation. The board reconvened 30 minutes later. The air in the room felt denser, less like confrontation, more like inevitability assembling itself piece by piece. Harold resumed his seat at the head of the table, though the position no longer carried the same gravitational certainty. We will proceed methodically, he said. Before any vote on suspension or review, the board deserves full disclosure from Silver Harbor's principal. Rachel nodded once. My client is prepared to attend. There was a pause. Then the door opened. Monica Webb entered without escort. She was dressed simply in a charcoal suit, hair pulled back, expression composed. She did not rush. She did not scan the room for reactions. She walked to the open seat beside Rachel and sat down. No one spoke for several seconds. The narrator understands that this silence is not theatrical. It is recalibration. The room must reconcile the image of the quiet daughter-in-law with the legal reality of majority control. Harold looked at her first. You orchestrated this, he said. Monica met his gaze steadily. I executed a legal acquisition, she replied. Jonathan leaned forward. Secretly, compliantly, she corrected. Eleanor's voice was soft but strained. Why, Monica? The question was not rhetorical. Monica folded her hands lightly on the table. Because the numbers did not match the statements she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She spoke as she always had measured, precise. Jonathan shook his head. You misinterpret strategic liquidity management as deception. Monica inclined her head slightly. Then independent audit will confirm that, she said. Brian Keller interjected. Internal capital transfers are common practice. They stabilize reporting. Without disclosure, Monica asked gently. Brian hesitated. They are reflected in consolidated statements. Not in timing, she replied. Harold's voice deepened. You could have come to us. Monica looked at him for a long moment. I did, she said quietly. The room stilled. She did not elaborate, but the memory lingered her question about debt maturity schedules dismissed publicly. Harold's expression tightened. That was not an invitation to acquire control, he said. No, Monica agreed. It was a signal. Jonathan let out a breath of frustration. This is personal. Monica's gaze shifted to him. If it were personal, she said, I would have spoken in anger. Instead, I filed documentation. The distinction was unmistakable. Rachel projected a summary slide again, ownership structure, acquisition timeline, regulatory compliance confirmations. Monica spoke now not as wife, but as controlling shareholder. I began acquiring shares 9 months ago when AGC's market valuation fell below asset baseline. At that time, I did not suspect misrepresentation. I saw opportunity. She paused. As my holdings increased shareholder rights, granted access to additional financial disclosures. That is when patterns emerged. She gestured lightly toward the timeline. Bridge transfers through Cayman subsidiaries timed directly before earnings disclosures. Reversed within days. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Liquidity management, Monica nodded. If disclosed clearly, yes. If framed as stable liquidity without context, no. An independent director, Margaret Hill, spoke for the first time since Monica entered. "Are you alleging intent to mislead?" Monica's response was careful. "I am alleging sufficient evidence to require independent investigation." The wording mattered. Intent would be determined by audit. Monica did not prejudge. Harold leaned forward. "You realize what public investigation does to shareholder confidence?" "Yes," Monica replied, "which is why internal review is preferable." Brian's voice carried strain now. Even suggesting regulatory referral damages market trust. Monica held his gaze. Failing to act damages it more. Silence followed. The narrator sees what is unfolding beneath the words. Authority is shifting from charisma to compliance. The Aldridge empire had relied on narrative cohesion. Monica was replacing narrative with record. Thomas remained quiet, though his presence was no longer peripheral. Every glance toward him carried implicit expectation. Finally, Jonathan spoke again. "You want my position?" he said. Monica shook her head once. "No." "Then what accountability?" Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "You would remove your husband's father and brother from leadership." "I would suspend executive authority pending audit," Monica corrected. Eleanor's composure thinned. "And if the audit finds no wrongdoing, then leadership resumes," Monica said simply. There was no trace of sarcasm. Margaret Hill leaned back in her chair. "From a governance perspective," she said slowly, "we are obligated to evaluate credible documentation. Majority shareholder has presented material evidence." Another director nodded. The optics of ignoring this are worse than review. Jonathan looked around the table. "You're prepared to dismantle decades of leadership over email phrasing and timing." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "We're prepared to fulfill fiduciary duty." Harold closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the certainty that had defined him for decades was thinner but not gone. "You could have destroyed us quietly," he said to Monica. Monica considered that. "Yes," she replied. "But that would have been personal." The statement settled differently than accusation ever could. Rachel slid a printed resolution across the table. "Motion to initiate independent forensic audit," she read, "with temporary suspension of CEO and chairman operational authority during review." Harold stared at the document. Jonathan looked at Thomas. "This is your wife," he said. Thomas inhaled slowly. "This is majority control," he replied. The distinction was final. The vote began. One by one, directors stated their positions. Margaret Hill in favor. David Levinson in favor. 2 more independent directors in favor. Jonathan opposed. Harold hesitated. The room waited. He could vote against, but the majority threshold had already been crossed through Silver Harbor's voting power. He understood arithmetic. He exhaled slowly. "Abstain," he said. The motion passed. Jonathan's shoulders stiffened. Brian's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers. Eleanor looked at Monica not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. The narrator understands that this is the formal collapse of unquestioned authority. But Monica did not smile. She did not lean back in triumph. Instead, she spoke once more. "I will not assume executive leadership," she said. "An interim external executive will be appointed." Jonathan looked up sharply. "You don't even want the job," no, Monica said. The answer unsettled him more than ambition would have. "Then why buy it?" he demanded. Monica met his gaze evenly. "Because ownership is responsibility. The boardroom no longer belonged to bloodline. It belonged to structure." Harold rose slowly from his chair. "For now," he said, your voice steady, though quieter than before, "I will comply with the board's directive." It was not surrender. It was acknowledgement. As Monica gathered her documents, she felt no surge of victory, only gravity. Because power gained through documentation carries consequences beyond personal vindication. Investigations follow. Reputations fracture, families change. Thomas remained seated for a moment longer than the others. When he finally stood, he did not look at his father. He looked at Monica. and for the first time, he understood the full measure of her. The room did not empty immediately. Votes settle faster than consequences. After the resolution passed, the independent directors remained seated, reviewing procedural next steps. The corporate secretary began drafting formal minutes. Rachel coordinated quietly with outside counsel to initiate engagement with a forensic audit firm. Across the table, Jonathan remained standing. "You've made your point," he said to Monica, his voice controlled, but edged. "Now what?" "You dragged this into the press." Monica gathered her papers with unhurried precision. "No," she replied. "You disclose appropriately once findings are confirmed." Brian Keller's hands were no longer steady. He cleared his throat. "We need to control the narrative before markets react." Margaret Hill looked at him evenly. "We need to control the facts." The difference hung in the air. Harold remained seated at the head of the table, though the title attached to the seat had shifted. Temporary suspension of operational authority meant he could not direct the process. He could observe it. Observation was unfamiliar territory. "Monica," he said finally, initially his voice less forceful than before, "if the audit finds nothing material, the damage from the spectacle will be irreversible." Monica met his gaze. "If the audit finds nothing material, the company strengthens," she replied. There was no malice in her tone, only sequence. Rachel stood. "The independent forensic team will require full access to internal financial records, including offshore subsidiaries and executive correspondence," she said. "Cooperation is not optional." Jonathan let out a quiet, humorless breath. "You speak as though we're criminals," Rachel answered calmly. "I speak as though governance matters." The narrator understands that language here is everything. No one has been indicted. No federal agents have arrived. Yet the architecture of accountability has begun assembling itself. Within hours of the vote, AGC's Internal Compliance Department received formal notice of audit initiation. Secure servers were locked for preservation of electronic records. Legal hold memos were distributed to senior executives. Brian Keller read the memo twice. Legal hold. The phrase tightened his chest. In the executive hallway outside the boardroom, Eleanor approached Monica for the first time without an audience. "You could have warned us," she said quietly. Monica stopped. "I asked questions," she replied. Eleanor's composure faltered slightly. "You don't understand what this does to legacy." Monica held her gaze. "I understand what undisclosed risk does to public trust." The words were not sharp, they were measured. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, perhaps seeing not an intruder, but a mirror of the discipline she herself had once valued before narrative replaced scrutiny. Thomas exited the boardroom last. He did not approach his father immediately. Instead, he stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. His phone buzzed. Text messages from family members, already aware something had shifted. The corporate secretary had been efficient. News traveled internally fast. He silenced the phone. Monica walked toward him. "Are you staying?" she asked gently. "For now," he said. He looked at her, searching again, not for justification, but for certainty. "You knew this would hurt," he said. "Yes. And you did it anyway?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Because it was right. Because it was necessary." The distinction mattered. Across the hall, Harold and Jonathan argued in low, urgent tones. "You should have resisted," Jonathan said sharply. "And do what Harold replied. Overrule majority control." Jonathan's silence answered. Harold exhaled slowly. "She's not reckless," he said. "That's what worries me." Inside the boardroom, Margaret Hill addressed the remaining directors. "We must prepare for potential regulatory inquiry," she said. "Even if we manage this internally, the existence of an audit will require disclosure in our next filing." One director asked, "What about the audio?" Rachel responded evenly. "The audio will remain internal unless cooperation fails." The implication was precise. Compliance offered containment. Resistance offered exposure. By late afternoon, AGC's senior finance team received formal requests for full ledger access covering the previous 8 quarters. Offshore banking partners were notified of pending audit review. External forensic accountants began coordinating data transfer protocols. Brian Keller sat alone in his office, staring at his screen. He had convinced himself that the bridge transfers were temporary stabilization, that the company would recover before scrutiny deepened. That narrative management was part of executive duty. Now documentation stripped that rationalization bare. His inbox chimed. Subject preservation notice. Personal devices. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. Back in the Aldridge penthouse that evening, the atmosphere was altered. No raised voices, no public accusations. But silence carried weight. Eleanor poured tea with mechanical precision. Harold remained seated in his study, staring at framed photographs. From earlier decades, ribbon cuttings, awards, televised debates moderated under the AGC logo. Legacy once unquestioned, now subject to audit. Thomas entered quietly. You could have told me, Harold said without turning. Thomas stood behind him. She tried, he replied. Harold closed his eyes briefly. I built this, he murmured. And she preserved it, Thomas said. The words were not defiant, they were reflective. Meanwhile, Monica sat alone at the dining table reviewing the preliminary audit engagement letter. She read every clause, carefully scoped authority, confidentiality parameters. She did not feel vindicated. She felt aware. Because audit is not a weapon. It is illumination. And illumination rarely spares anyone entirely. Her phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. SEC inquiry, likely once filing updated. Be prepared. Monica typed back, understood. She set the phone down. Thomas joined her a moment later. They're furious, he said. I know. They feel betrayed. Monica folded the engagement letter neatly. I did not betray them, she said softly. I followed procedure. Thomas studied her. I don't know how to be in the middle of this, he admitted. Monica reached for his hand, not as strategist, not as shareholder, but as partner. You don't stand in the middle, she said. You stand where you believe truth is. He looked down at their joined hands. I'm not sure yet, he said honestly. That's okay, she replied. The narrator sees the slow burn, here not explosive confrontation, but internal realignment. Monica does not demand allegiance. She does not threaten departure. She allows space. Space can be more destabilizing than accusation. As night settled over Manhattan, financial news outlets began noting unusual board activity at AGC. No specifics yet, only whispers of governance review. Markets react to whispers. By the next morning, AGC's stock dipped modestly. Not catastrophic, not yet. In his office, Jonathan drafted a statement to be released once legally required. Aldridge Global Communications has initiated an independent review to strengthen governance practices and reinforce long-term shareholder value. The language was polished, measured, almost clinical. Monica read the draft later that day when circulated for board approval. She made one edit, replaced strengthen governance practices with review recent financial disclosures. Precision mattered. Jonathan saw the edit. He did not argue, because the era of narrative dominance had ended. Documentation now defined reality, and documentation once presented does not retreat quietly. Authority does not collapse in a single sound. It erodes in layers. By the third day after the board vote, AGC's internal servers were under controlled review. Forensic auditors from an independent firm occupied 2 glass-walled conference rooms on the 39th floor. They worked without drama headphones on spreadsheets, open digital logs scrolling across monitors. No one outside the company yet knew the scale of documentation being examined. But inside, tension moved like a low current. Harold no longer occupied the chairman's office. The nameplate remained on the door, but operational access had been temporarily reassigned. An interim compliance liaison coordinated between the auditors and department heads. Jonathan's access privileges had been limited to advisory capacity pending review. It was not dismissal, it was suspension. And suspension for men accustomed to uninterrupted command felt like exile. Monica did not visit headquarters during those days. She monitored updates remotely, reviewing summaries sent by Rachel and the audit firm. The findings were not explosive. They were cumulative. Patterns confirmed. Bridge transfers documented in greater volume than initially disclosed. Internal memos discussing market optics repeated across quarters. Draft earnings scripts revised to soften risk language, none of it theatrical, all of it consequential. On Thursday morning, the independent audit team requested direct interviews with senior executives. Brian Keller was first. He entered the conference room carrying a leather folder he did not open. Two auditors sat across from him, neutral in expression. "We're reviewing intercompany liquidity adjustments," one said. Brian nodded. "Standard practice," he replied. "Explain the timing relative to earnings calls." Brian hesitated only slightly. Liquidity confidence matters to investors. Confidence or accuracy, the auditor asked. Brian did not answer immediately. The transcript would reflect that pause. Meanwhile, in a private residence across the city, Harold reviewed a draft summary of preliminary audit observations delivered confidentially to the board. He read it twice. The language was careful but clear. Patterns of temporary liquidity transfers coincide with earnings reporting periods. Disclosure language insufficiently specific regarding timing and reversal. Insufficiently specific. Harold placed the document down. He had always believed leadership required confidence, that public strength stabilized markets, that disclosure could be managed to protect long-term value. But reading the auditor's phrasing, he saw how that confidence appeared from the outside, calculated. Thomas arrived that afternoon without announcing himself. Harold did not look surprised. "You've come to lecture me?" he asked. "No," Thomas said. "I came to listen." Harold exhaled slowly. "She thinks this is about numbers," he said. "It is," Thomas replied. Harold shook his head. "It's about perception." Thomas considered that. "Perception built on omission isn't stability," he said quietly. Harold studied his son for a long moment. "You've chosen her side." Thomas did not answer directly. "I've chosen clarity," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but accurate. Back at the penthouse, Eleanor sat with Monica in the living room for the first time without an event, without guests, without performance. "You've always been observant," Eleanor said softly. Monica folded her hands. "I prefer documentation." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "You think we didn't document Monica met her gaze. I think you documented selectively. The honesty was not cruel." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "When Harold inherited this company, it was fragile," she said. "He protected it through storms you never saw." "I don't doubt that," Monica replied. "Then why dismantle him?" "I didn't dismantle him," Monica said gently. "I asked for review." Eleanor's composure thinned. "You could have spoken to us privately." "I did," Monica answered quietly. The memory hung between them, dismissed questions, softened warnings. Eleanor looked away first. By Friday, the auditors had expanded scope to include executive communications on personal devices used for company business. The legal hold extended beyond servers. Jonathan's irritation had hardened into visible strain. "This is overreach," he told the interim compliance liaison. "It's protocol," she replied. The phrase repeated often that week. Protocol, fiduciary duty, disclosure. Language shifted from loyalty to legality. In a closed executive session Friday afternoon, the independent directors reviewed interim findings. Margaret Hill spoke first. "The pattern is consistent," she said. "We must consider formal removal of executive authority if intent to mislead appears credible." Another director added, "Even absent criminal exposure, governance reform is necessary." Rachel listened without interruption. Monica attended remotely, camera off, a voice present only when requested. She did not guide the conversation. She allowed the structure to function. The narrator understands that this restraint is power. She could push harder. Instead, she lets the evidence carry weight. Late Friday evening, AGC received a formal inquiry notice. from the Securities and Exchange Commission requesting clarification regarding recent governance disclosures. It was not a subpoena. It was not an indictment. It was a request. But requests from regulators are not casual. Harold read the notice silently. Jonathan slammed his hand against his desk. "This is because of her," he said. Harold shook his head. "No," he replied slowly. "It's because of us." The acknowledgement cost him. In the boardroom Monday morning, a second vote was placed before the directors. Motion removal of Jonathan Aldridge from CEO position pending completion of forensic audit. Motion formal resignation of Harold Aldridge as chairman during regulatory review. Jonathan stared at the resolution. "You're capitulating," he said. Margaret met his gaze evenly. "We are protecting the company." The vote proceeded. In favor. In favor. In favor. Jonathan opposed. Harold abstained again. The motions passed. Authority reversed, not through shouting, not through scandal, but through structured sequence. Monica received the notification quietly at home. She closed her eyes briefly, not in satisfaction, in recognition, because consequences do not differentiate between guilt and pride. Thomas stood in the doorway. "It's done," he said. "For now," she replied. He stepped inside. "My father will never forgive this." Monica looked at him. "I didn't do this to be forgiven." He nodded slowly. "I know." Outside media outlets began reporting leadership changes at AGC. Governance review leads to executive suspension, one headline read. Markets dipped further, but stabilized by afternoon, when interim leadership was announced. Professional managers replaced family command. Transparency began replacing legacy narrative. That evening, Harold packed personal documents from his office. He paused at the doorway before leaving. For the first time in decades, he exited without certainty of return. The narrator sees what remains unspoken collapse is rarely loud. It is administrative. Signed resolutions, formal votes, quiet elevators descending from executive floors. Monica stood by her apartment window as dusk settled over Manhattan. She did not smile. She did not call anyone. She watched the skyline, aware that the company she now controlled no longer resembled the one she had entered through marriage. Power had reversed. But victory was not the word she would use. Responsibility was. And responsibility, once accepted, does not lighten easily. Power leaves residue. It lingers in hallways after titles are removed. It echoes in conversations that no longer carry authority, but still carry memory. By the following week, AGC operated under interim leadership, appointed unanimously by the independent directors. An experienced media executive from outside the Aldridge circle assumed temporary CEO responsibilities. The transition was procedural, efficient, almost clinical. But inside the Aldridge family, nothing felt clinical. Harold had not returned to headquarters. Jonathan issued a brief internal message thanking staff for their continued professionalism during review. It read like a man negotiating with inevitability. Monica received updates daily. Audit progress, regulatory correspondence, preliminary compliance adjustments. She responded only when necessary. The narrator understands that this phase is not about confrontation. It is about consequence. And consequences, once set in motion, reshape relationships more profoundly than public humiliation ever could. One evening, Thomas asked her to meet him on the balcony. The city below moved in soft lines of light. Manhattan did not care who owned which company. It never had. "My mother won't speak to me," Thomas said quietly. Monica did not react with surprise. I expected that she replied, "My father? He thinks I betrayed him." "You didn't," she said. Thomas leaned against the railing. "I didn't stop you." Monica turned slightly toward him. "Would you have if I told you earlier?" He did not answer immediately. "Yes," he admitted. "That's why I didn't." He nodded slowly. "You took the choice from me. I protected the process," she said gently. Thomas let out a soft breath. "You always speak in structure. It keeps emotion from distorting truth." He studied her face. "And what about us?" Is that structure too? The question lingered between them. Monica stepped closer, though she did not touch him yet. I never purchased AGC to win against your family, she said quietly. I purchased undervalued shares in a fragile company. What followed was documentation. And what followed for us, he pressed. That depends on what you believe, she answered. Thomas looked out over the city again. I grew up thinking legacy was something sacred, he said. Something that deserved protection. It does, Monica replied. But protection and concealment are not the same. He closed his eyes briefly. I don't know who I am without that legacy. Monica's voice softened. You're not your father's position. He looked at her. And you're not just my wife. The statement carried no accusation, only realization. Inside AGC headquarters, auditors completed their preliminary findings. The report did not accuse executives of criminal fraud. It did conclude that liquidity disclosures had been materially incomplete, and that executive communications demonstrated awareness of timing sensitivity relative to earnings perception. Materially incomplete. The phrase carried regulatory weight. Rachel reviewed the summary with Monica over a secure call. The board will need to formally acknowledge deficiencies, Rachel said. Corrective action and possible negotiated resolution with regulators. Will there be charges, Monica asked. Unlikely criminal unless further evidence surfaces. Civil penalties possible. Monica nodded once. And Harold Jonathan resignations may satisfy regulatory expectations, Rachel replied. Monica did not respond immediately. Resignation is quieter than removal, but it carries permanence. That evening, Thomas visited his parents' townhouse alone. Eleanor opened the door herself. You've chosen your side, she said without greeting. Thomas stepped inside. I chose truth, he replied. Eleanor's composure cracked for a moment. Truth is not always clean, she said. No, he agreed. But hiding it isn't protection. Harold emerged from his study. Is she satisfied? He asked. Thomas met his father's gaze. She never wanted satisfaction. Harold studied him. She wanted control. Thomas shook his head slowly. She wanted accountability. Harold turned away. Accountability destroys legacies. Thomas's voice remained steady. Lack of it destroys them faster. The silence that followed felt heavier than anger. Back at the apartment, Monica sat at the dining table, reviewing a draft public statement prepared by interim leadership Aldridge Global Communications, acknowledges the findings of an independent forensic audit. While no evidence of criminal conduct was identified, the review concluded that certain liquidity disclosures were insufficiently detailed. The board has accepted the resignations of Harold Aldridge as chairman and Jonathan Aldridge as CEO, effective immediately. Monica read it twice. She made no edits. It was accurate. The next morning, the statement was released. Markets reacted with volatility, but not collapse. Transparency steadied what secrecy had destabilized. Harold submitted his formal resignation letter. It was brief. For the good of the company, I step aside. Jonathan's letter followed. Neither mentioned Monica. They did not need to. The narrative had already shifted. Thomas read the statements in silence. It's final, he said. Yes, Monica replied. He sat across from her. My family thinks you destroyed them. Monica looked at him carefully. I removed concealment, she said. They dismantled themselves. He studied her for a long time. And us, he asked again. Monica folded her hands. I will not force you to stand beside me publicly, she said. If you choose to distance yourself, I will understand. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. You think I'd leave because it's uncomfortable. I think you're still deciding who you are, she said gently. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. I loved you before any of this, he said. I know, I still do. She rose slowly and joined him. Then don't love me as opposition to them, she said quietly. Love me because you believe this was right. Thomas turned toward her fully. And if I'm not sure yet, then take time, she replied. The narrator sees that this is the true fracture point, not corporate governance, not regulatory letters. Identity. Monica does not demand allegiance. She offers space. Space is harder than confrontation. Days later, Thomas returned from a final meeting with his father. Harold had not shouted. He had not condemned. He had simply said the company was my life. Thomas understood that. But he also understood something else now. It's not your life, Monica told him that night. It was his, Thomas replied. And now she asked. Thomas looked at her. Now it's structure. The word felt foreign to him once. Now it felt grounding. Monica reached for his hand. I never wanted to choose between you and governance, she said softly. You didn't, he answered. You chose governance. He inhaled slowly. And I choose you. The statement was not dramatic. It was deliberate. The residue of power remained, but the balance had shifted. Harold and Jonathan stepped away from AGC publicly with restrained dignity. Monica did not comment. She did not appear in interviews. She remained behind documentation. Because victory was never her language, correction was. And correction, once complete, leaves room only for what comes next. Resignation is quieter than defeat. There were no cameras outside the Aldridge townhouse when Harold signed the final transition documents. No reporters camped along the sidewalk. The market cycle had already shifted its attention elsewhere. In finance, scandal without spectacle becomes a footnote, quickly provided it is addressed with discipline. AGC's board moved with calculated efficiency. Within 48 hours of the resignation announcements, the independent audit report was formally submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission in response to its inquiry. The language was restrained, factual, and devoid of emotional framing. Certain liquidity management practices resulted in materially incomplete disclosures regarding timing and reversal of intercompany transfers. Corrective action has been implemented. No dramatic confession, no theatrical denial, just structured acknowledgement. Monica read the final version from her study. She did not alter a word. The narrator understands that this stage is where many stories falter, where power newly consolidated becomes performative. Monica does not perform. She consolidates governance, not authority. An emergency board session was scheduled to finalize long-term leadership restructuring. Monica attended in person this time. The boardroom felt different, less charged, less defensive. Interim CEO David Lynn presented a strategic recovery plan. Immediate halt to stock buybacks, appointment of a permanent independent audit committee, enhanced disclosure language in quarterly filings, restructuring of offshore subsidiary oversight, separation of chairman and CEO roles permanently. Each point addressed a fracture revealed during review. Monica listened without interruption. Margaret Hill turned toward her. As majority shareholder, do you intend to assume executive leadership? She asked. The question had circulated quietly among directors all week. Monica folded her hands. No, she said. Jonathan had once assumed she sought his seat. Harold had believed control was the objective. But Monica had never prepared a leadership speech. She had prepared documentation. I will retain controlling interest, she continued. But operational management should remain with experienced executives independent of familial influence. Margaret nodded slowly. That separation may stabilize investor confidence, she said. It will, Monica replied. The vote to confirm David Lynn as permanent CEO passed unanimously. The vote to formalize governance reforms followed. Sequence, structure, closure. After the meeting, Monica remained seated while others filed out. The room no longer felt hostile. It felt transitional. Rachel approached quietly. The SEC is unlikely to pursue aggressive penalties, she said. Civil fines, possible. But cooperation mitigated risk, Monica nodded. And Harold resignation satisfied expectations, Rachel replied. Monica absorbed that without visible reaction. Thomas waited near the windows, watching the skyline. He had not attended every session during the review period. He had needed distance, but he attended this one. When the room emptied, he approached her. It's over, he said. It stabilized, she corrected gently. He almost smiled. You never use the word over. Because structures evolve, she replied. He studied her. Are you staying? He asked. She understood the question was larger than geography. I will step down from day-to-day oversight once reforms are embedded, she said. Silver Harbor will remain majority shareholder, but I will not live inside AGC. Thomas exhaled quietly. And us, Monica, met his gaze. That depends on whether we build something independent of this. The silence between them was no longer fractured. It was reflective. Later that afternoon, Monica requested a private meeting with Harold. Not in the boardroom, not in a public office, in a neutral conference room on the 20th floor. Harold arrived alone. He looked older, not physically diminished, but stripped of the insulation authority provides. You won, he said without greeting. Monica shook her head slightly. No, he studied her. You took what my father built. I preserved what investors trusted, she replied calmly. Harold sat across from her. I convinced myself it was temporary, he said quietly, that we would recover before anyone noticed. Monica listened. That's how misjudgment begins, she said gently. He looked at her sharply, not in anger, but in recognition. You never hated us, he said. No, you could have exposed everything publicly. Yes. Why didn't you? Monica paused. Because the company deserved correction, not spectacle. Harold leaned back slowly. For what it's worth, he said you were right about the debt maturity schedule. The admission was small, but it was real. Monica inclined her head. Thank you. They sat in silence for several moments. Legacy had shifted, but dignity, at least in that room, remained intact. When she stood to leave, Harold spoke once more. Take care of it, he said. I will, Monica replied. Outside the building, autumn air moved through Manhattan with restrained coolness. AGC's stock price had stabilized after initial volatility. Analysts cited decisive governance correction as a positive sign. Correction, not conquest. That distinction mattered. Back at the apartment, Monica began reviewing transition documents for Silver Harbor's long-term holding structure. She appointed 2 external trustees to oversee compliance monitoring. She reduced her direct involvement to quarterly review sessions. She did not insert herself into editorial policy. She did not reshape programming. She did not make symbolic public appearances. Ownership remained quiet. Thomas watched her pack a folder into a locked cabinet. You could have taken the CEO role, he said. I never wanted it. You had the power. I used it. He nodded slowly. For correction? Yes. The narrator sees what remains unresolved, not conflict, but direction. Power reversed. Authority redistributed. But identity now stands on open ground. That evening, Monica walked once more through AGC's headquarters alone. She did not announce herself. She did not request escort. She paused briefly outside the boardroom where she had once been dismissed as decorative. The glass walls reflected the city behind her. She did not linger long, because the room no longer held emotional weight. It was just structure. And structure, once corrected, no longer required confrontation. She exited the building without looking back, not in triumph, not in resentment, simply in closure. The final board meeting Monica attended lasted less than 40 minutes. No raised voices, no legal threats, no defensiveness disguised as confidence. The agenda was procedural ratification of governance reforms, confirmation of executive restructuring, acknowledgement of regulatory compliance measures in progress. David Lynn presented revised disclosure language for the upcoming quarterly filing. The audit committee chair outlined enhanced internal controls. Independent directors voted with efficiency that bordered on relief. The room that had once laughed at her now functioned on documentation she had insisted upon. Monica sat near the middle of the table, not at the head. She did not seek the symbolic seat. When the final motion passed unanimously, Margaret Hill turned to her. On behalf of the board, she said, "Thank you for insisting on structure." The phrasing was careful. Not praise, recognition. Monica inclined her head slightly. Governance protects everyone, she replied, even those who resist it. Thomas sat beside her, quiet but present. He had attended more consistently since choosing to stand beside her, not as proxy, not as shield, but as himself. After adjournment, directors gathered their folders and filtered out. The energy was subdued, not celebratory. Jonathan was not present. He had relocated temporarily to the West Coast, issuing a brief statement about personal recalibration. Harold had not returned to headquarters since his resignation meeting with Monica. Eleanor had sent a handwritten note 2 days earlier. You were prepared. I underestimated that. No apology, but not denial. Monica remained seated after the room emptied. The skyline beyond the glass walls looked unchanged. But the air inside the building felt different, lighter, less performative. Thomas waited by the door. You don't have to stay, he said gently. I'm not, she replied. She gathered her notebook, the same slim leather one she had carried into the first humiliating board session months earlier. Inside it were dated entries, debt maturity schedules, liquidity ratio calculations, meeting timestamps. She did not tear out the pages. She closed it. That was enough. As they walked down the hallway, staff members nodded politely, some with gratitude, some with curiosity, a few with quiet respect. No one applauded. Accountability rarely earns applause. In the elevator, Thomas studied her reflection in the mirrored walls. You don't look relieved, he said. I'm not, she replied. He waited. I'm steady, she added. He nodded slowly. The narrator understands the distinction. Relief implies emotional release. Steadiness implies alignment. Outside the building, reporters waited, but not aggressively. The story had already crested and receded in the news cycle. Governance correction is less marketable than scandal. A journalist called out Miss Webb. Do you consider this a victory? Monica paused only briefly. I consider it resolved, she said. No more. Thomas watched her as they crossed the street. You never once attacked them publicly, he said. There was no need. And now? Now the company operates transparently. He looked at her. And us. She stopped walking. This was the question that had hovered quietly through months of tension. I will not live inside AGC, she said softly. Silver Harbor retains its position. Governance remains structured. But I don't intend to anchor our life to this. Thomas exhaled. You're willing to step back. I never stepped forward for control, she replied. He searched her face for hesitation. There was none. My father thinks I abandoned legacy, he said quietly. Monica reached for his hand. You chose integrity. He looked down at their joined hands. And you chose documentation over anger. Yes. He smiled faintly. That's your version of rebellion. She almost smiled. It's my version of correction. They walked toward the park without further comment. Weeks later, the SEC issued a formal notice concluding its review. AGC would pay a civil penalty for disclosure deficiencies. No criminal charges were filed. Cooperation and governance reform mitigated severity. The market stabilized fully. Analysts cited AGC as an example of shareholder-driven structural accountability. Monica declined interview requests. She did not write op-eds. She did not attend conferences. Silver Harbor Holdings remained majority shareholder, but delegated oversight to independent trustees as promised. The Aldridge name faded gradually from corporate headlines. Harold retreated into private advisory work. Jonathan pursued independent ventures outside traditional media. Eleanor maintained her public poise, and Monica returned to quiet consulting work under her own name. One evening, months later, Thomas found her at the dining table reviewing a new financial model, this time for a small renewable energy startup. You're analyzing risk again, he observed. I always am, she replied. He sat across from her. Do you ever regret it? He asked. She looked up. Buying AGC, yes. She considered the question carefully. No, she said. Even knowing what it cost, yes. Because cost without correction compounds. He nodded slowly. You never tried to humiliate them back, he said. There was nothing to gain. The narrator understands that this is the final inversion. They humiliated her publicly, believing she had no standing. She corrected them structurally without spectacle. power reversed, but dignity remained intact. Later that night, Monica stepped onto the balcony alone. The city stretched out beneath her indifferent constant. She thought about the first board meeting, the laughter, the phrase married into. She felt no anger toward it now, only memory. Because authority does not belong to bloodline. It belongs to those who understand its obligations. She had never needed to raise her voice. She had only needed to prepare. And preparation, when aligned with truth, becomes its own form of quiet strength. Monica Webb did not walk away from AGC defeated. She walked away aligned, not victorious, not vindictive, aligned. And that in the end was enough. There are moments in life when humiliation tempts retaliation, when silence feels like surrender, when legacy appears immovable. But quiet strength is not passive. It observes. It prepares. It documents. Monica never fought with volume. She fought with structure. She never exposed for spectacle. She corrected for integrity. And when power shifted, she did not use it to wound, only to stabilize. Accountability rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks procedural, measured, almost ordinary. But inside those procedures live the choices that define character. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that dignity and documentation can speak louder than pride, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's powerful to see how far stories of quiet strength travel. And if you value stories about integrity, governance, and resilience, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Some battles are loud. The most decisive ones are silent.